Welcome back, Sebastian here. So I have a little bit more time this week, next week than I originally thought. So while I do have some videos scheduled in my quality ranking series I've been doing the last week or so, you will get a couple extra videos in between as well before the next race, the Dutch Grand Prix. So today to start off, I want to take a look at mid-season storylines going on through basically the mid part of the 2025 F1 season. I think there's six in total that I picked out that I want to talk about. Some of these couldn't get resolved in the next couple days or so, and others are going to, roll on until the end of the season. And again, order isn't too important, but I just felt, six things I thought would be interesting. So number one, I think first and foremost is the 2025 F1 title fight between the two McLaren drivers, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. We haven't had this kind of a title fight between two teammates since 2016, which is almost a decade ago now, between Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton. And of course, you have a pretty intense inter-team dynamic there. Very, very fast cars. Will probably win not all, but almost all of the remaining races, I would say, for the rest of the season. And again, it'll be really, really close, interesting to see how it goes. Does it go all the way to Abu Dhabi? Does one driver kind of get a bit of an advantage, a stranglehold on the championship, and maybe wins a round or two early? Does someone get a mechanical issue, or is there some really intense, crash where one driver gets knocked out, maybe the other doesn't, and that obviously could swing the points total massively as well. So again, F1 title fight for the second half of the season should be pretty interesting and should be a good storyline to follow, even if the races aren't so good on track. The fact that you have this title fight, 9 points between the two of them, as of the recording of this video, means that it should be a pretty interesting storyline to follow for the rest of the season. So next up is the Cadillac driver lineup, and of course Cadillac coming in brand new team next year, 2026. First time that we've had a new team in F1 in a decade. Last time it was Haas, again a decade ago in 2016. So it will be very interesting to see who they choose. That being said, a lot of very high-level reports are suggesting that their lineup's basically solidified, and in all likelihood, it's probably going to be Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas, which I think for where Cadillac are right now, for all intents and purposes, it is a pretty good lineup. A little bit uninspiring. I think it would have been nice to see a young driver like Alex Dunn, Paul Aaron, or maybe even an IndyCar driver like Alex Palou get a shot at F1. But I think it's a very pragmatic and sensible choice. I think even if the two drivers are a bit on the older side, I do think a pretty strong lineup again for a team coming into its first season, much better than, for example, what Hispania ran their first year, where they had Bruno Senna and Karun Chandhok to start the year. But again, this is a storyline that likely is going to be wrapped up in the next couple weeks or so, as both drivers are out of contract. So again, shouldn't be too difficult to basically sign them and then announce them in pretty short order. Now, number 3 is the 2026 Red Bull family lineup. So, of course, you have 4 seats in the Red Bull family, 2 at Red Bull, 2 at Racing Bulls. Max Verstappen, at this point, we know he's definitely going to be at the Red Bull seat for 2026. But other than that, it's basically open season. The fact that both Bottas and Perez are likely going to be driving for Cadillac means that that's an opportunity that Yuki Tsunoda possibly could have had. That is now kind of a door that's being shut on him. And again, there aren't a whole lot of other veteran options available. I guess in theory, the best I would say veteran available in terms of drivers with recent F1 experience would probably be Magnussen. But I think most drivers probably wouldn't want to sign him, and I think he's kind of moved on to better things over in WEC. But that being said, what the Red Bull family decides to do with their other 3 remaining seats is yet to be seen. Of course, you have Tsunoda. Good chance he's out, given that this is after this season. Red Bull's ties with Honda officially end, and Tsunoda has always had very strong ties with Honda, and Honda's part of the reason why he basically was in the program Red Bull family in the first place. Then of course you have Hadjar, rookie driver, performing pretty well. I think, maybe some of the hype has cooled off a little bit the last 4 or 5 races, as I think, Lawson has gone a little bit closer to him. And that's something I can talk about in a video in a couple of days' time. But that being said, I still think, the expectation, he's definitely outperformed, I think, most people's expectations. So again, he could potentially, slot in alongside Max Verstappen at Red Bull. Then, of course, you have Liam Lawson, who I think, there's a lot of pressure on him first, 8-9 races of the season. But things have gotten better the last couple races, and he's now only 2 points behind Lawson, 2 points behind Hadjar in the points tally, despite the fact that he had a very, very slow start to the season. So I do think he's making Red Bull's decision making process a lot harder right now because of that. And then, of course, outside of the family, you do have Arvid Lindblad, who I think at this point still has a decent chance of making his F1 debut for 2026. He's currently 7th in the championship, 1 place lower than what Antonelli was last year. But I do think most people would say that this year's F2 championship is one a little bit weaker than last year, because of how many rookies graduated. But also, I think Prema was probably a worse car than the Campos that Lindblad is driving this year. So again, it will be interesting to see what Red Bull decide to do. Do they promote Lindblad? Do they give him another year? He's at this point probably not going to win the title. So again, there's no harm in giving him a second year in F2 to develop, and it means that if they really want to, they can just keep the same three drivers they have, and they could swap Tsunoda and Hadjar around if they felt they had to do that. But to be honest, I think in my opinion, given that there aren't a ton of other options available, and I know the gap between Verstappen and Tsunoda has basically been at historically big margins. I don't think it would be the worst thing in the world to just keep Tsunoda around for one more year, just because of the lack of other options, and also to give Hadjar another chance and not just throw him to the wolves that is being Max Verstappen's teammate. Now, moving on to the fourth thing, I would say constructors at this point is pretty well sealed up. McLaren will almost certainly win that. Then drivers' championship, first two in that championship is almost certainly going to be the McLarens in whichever order they finish in. So again, that kind of leads to the next best position being second in the constructors and third in the drivers. So I do think it'll be interesting to see how who basically gets those two positions. Of course, Verstappen's currently sitting in third, but I think Red Bull have definitely fallen off the pace a little bit the last couple months, especially with some of their failed upgrades, setup choices. Again, some bad luck in there as well. But Leclerc, Russell have both gotten pretty close to him for third. So again, that's going to be, I think, an interesting three-way battle there to see who finishes third in the drivers. And then for the constructors, I think unfortunately it's probably going to be down to just Red Bull or just Ferrari and Mercedes. Red Bull probably too far behind just because Tsunoda's barely scored any points this season, so it's basically just a one-car team from a points perspective, but it will be interesting to see who comes out on top between Ferrari and Mercedes. And you never know, if Red Bull somehow can really solidify themselves as the second best team rest of the season, if Tsunoda can turn his form around, they may also challenge those other two teams, because to be honest, they're not that far behind. But again, I think it will be an interesting storyline to follow for the rest of the season. Now, number 5 is new driver improvement. So this goes for both the two drivers pictured, Hamilton and Sainz, but also for the rookies as well, as I think it'll be interesting to see how the drivers who are driving for new teams this year, so all those rookies plus Hamilton and Sainz, how much they improve in the second half of the season now that they've kind of been embedded in the team. They've gotten 14 races under their belt with their respective teams, a little bit more in a couple of cases like Behrman, who of course did 2 races for Haas last year, but nonetheless it'll be interesting to see how much improvement there is that second half of the season. And then of course in the future we can say was this a sign of things to come in 2026, or was it perhaps a little bit of an aberration? So again, I think that's a pretty interesting, storyline to follow, especially given there's, so many different drivers who are driving for their new teams for the first time. I guess Ocon and Hulkenberg would both fit in that camp as well, just because they are experienced drivers. But again, given that their teammates are rookies, it's expected that their teammates are the ones who are going to have the, higher growth curve compared to them. So moving on to the final of our 6 ones, storylines to watch. This one is, what does Briatore do next? Actually, I think there might be a 7th one. So yes, what does Briatore do next? Of course, Alpine's kind of been a pretty chaotic team the last couple years or so. They, of course, dropped Ocon after his Monaco shunt last year, brought Doohan in, and then realized, oh yeah, there's this Colapinto kid who looks very good. So they basically dropped Doohan before he'd even done a full season with them. Before the season even started, they'd already basically decided that Colapinto was going to be driving at some point. And of course, Colapinto, I think, has been a bit of a disappointment. Definitely not as good as this time at Williams. And I do think there's quite a bit of pressure on him to perform. Now, of course, with both Bottas and Perez likely to sign for Cadillac, that takes two big experienced drivers, two drivers who I think could very easily have been, good candidates for an Alpine seat for 2026, and that kind of really takes them off the table. So I think at this point for 2026, I think it's really going to be a straight shootout between Colapinto and Paul Aron for that 2026 seat. I do think, given that, Colapinto does have a bit of sponsorship money, quite a bit, I would say. I do think that he's in the driver's seat, and I think as long as he can improve to be within, 2/10 or so of Gasly in qualifying pace, I think he needs to score a point or two for the rest of the season. Not a lot just because of how bad the Alpine is, but maybe a point here or there. I think that might be enough for Colapinto to secure himself another season in 2026. But again, Briatore is known for doing unpredictable things, being very ruthless, very harsh. So it'll be interesting to see what he decides to do with regards to that Alpine seat for 2026. Now, the final one that I want to talk about is the FIA elections coming up in December. Now, of course, Mohammed bin Salem, who is basically up, the FIA president, he of course is up for re-election, and so there's been quite a bit of contention between himself, the FOM, the teams, with regards to a whole lot of different things. And again, I could do an entire video going into things that have happened under his watch, but again, it is going to be a pretty interesting situation in December as he is up for re-election. In some camps, very unpopular, perhaps a little bit popular in others, but Tim Mayer, the American, who is basically formerly part of the COTA, basically organization, who are basically the promoters for the Grand Prix, for the US Grand Prix, is running against him. So it'll be interesting to see who ends up winning there. And again, I do expect, attacks, political rallying between the two of them to kind of ratchet up as we get closer to December. And of course, also FIA, FOM relations as well, especially with regards to the future of the power units for F1, I think is going to be a really big talking point. I think a lot of the teams, I think there's a lot of concern about these 2026 cars. A lot of concern, for example, that it's just going to be Formula E, where they're going to have to lift and coast down the straight. They're going to start losing speed halfway down straights and stuff. There's concerns about the complexity, the fact that the split between battery and ICE is, maybe a little bit too equal, and that it should be a little bit more to either what we have now or just, ditching the hybrid entirely. So again, MBS has basically inserted himself into that, suggesting things like V10s with biofuel. So again, that's all kind of a sticking point as well. And again, then that does play into the kind of the interactions between the FIA, FOM as well. So that's, I think, something to watch in the second half of the season. Maybe a little bit more dry of a topic, given that it doesn't really concern any of the drivers, doesn't really concern on-track action. But I do think the outcome of the elections could have a pretty big influence on where F1 goes in the next, 5 to 7 years or so. So anyway, that's my seven storylines to follow for the second half of the 2025 F1 season. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.